Does Karmelo Anthony have grounds to appeal his first-degree murder conviction of Austin Metcalf? I'll tell you which arguments I think may or may not have some teeth. I'm Keisha Toni Derry. Thank you for joining me today. Karmelo Anthony's new legal team, which has taken over for his appeal, has asked for the verdict to be thrown out entirely. They've accused the judge of bias, and they're asking for his recusal from the entire case. And they talk about a deal that the defense lawyers made with the prosecution that may have interfered with Karmelo Anthony's constitutional rights. So I'm going to go through all of these points that were made in this appeal, a quick summary of it, and I'll tell you exactly what I think the court will probably do with some of these arguments. So one of the first ones is that the defense argues that Karmelo's right to a public trial that's guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment was violated because there was limited impact or limited access to the trial. They say audio and video recordings were not allowed because the judge did not allow them, that there were not enough seats, that an overflow room that existed early on in the case was canceled. It was no longer available throughout the entirety of the trial. They cite people who traveled from as far as like Arizona to witness this trial in Texas, but they were not allowed in because there weren't enough seats. And they say that all of this combined means that Karmelo's right to a public trial was violated. Now, there are a lot of problems, frankly, with this argument. The first being that, number one, federal courts don't allow cameras. They don't allow recordings. That's why when you see certain trials, you see a picture, a painting, sketches of what's going on inside the courtroom because there aren't any cameras. So we know that cameras and video recordings not being allowed is not a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to a public trial. A public trial just means that the public has access to the proceedings. That includes an open gallery, which in this case, I think there were 24 seats. And obviously, you can't say that a public trial is going to have access for everyone in the world who wants to be in there. That would be ridiculous, and that's not what this constitutional principle means. All right. And so that's kind of the issue there. That I don't think this is really going to go that far, because the documents for this trial are available. You can go back and look at them. You can read them. They're accessible. Now, will people do that? That's a different story. Are people going to pull up the transcripts and read them? Probably not, because people are used to video and they want you to tell them everything that's going on. But public access, the right to a public trial, does not mean that everybody in the world gets a seat. Okay, so I don't think this argument is going anywhere. But that's the first argument that they make. All right, the second one is kind of juicy, and they make an ineffective assistance of counsel argument. That means they're saying that the lawyer who conducted the trial was ineffective. So they say that during the course of the trial, the lead prosecutor proposed to the defense that neither side would bring up character evidence, reputational evidence from either Karmelo Anthony or Austin Metcalf. So that means anything having to do with social media posts, interactions with teachers or friends, things that they did prior to this event. And both sides agreed to keep the trial within the four corners of what happened under that tent. That means they were only going to make a case about what happened that day in the tent when Karmelo Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf. They also make an argument about the defense not presenting some arguments about Karmelo Anthony possibly having epilepsy and the fact that his adolescent brain was not fully developed because he was only 17 or 18 at the time of this event. And they say that all of these things combined, in essence, impacted Karmelo's Fifth Amendment right to testify on his own behalf. Why? Because they say that this whole deal prevented Karmelo Anthony from getting on the stand, because ultimately the prosecutor said, well, there really isn't a deal if you put him on the stand, because if he goes on the stand, we're going to ask him about social media posts or anything like that may, ruin his reputation or character in front of the jury. And that's not really uncommon to have these kinds of deals. I'll just say that the prosecution and defense, or even in civil trials, and I can tell you this as a litigator, oftentimes you create deals with the other side to say, we're going to keep this about this event, or we're not going to bring in other issues that we are aware of that happened between these two people, because it complicates the facts and we just want to keep the facts very narrow. So these deals are not uncommon. They happen all the time. And the other thing I want to say that I missed, the defense also says that they only had 10 minutes to confer with Karmelo Anthony when the judge asked, hey, Mr. Anthony, are you going to testify in your own defense? And the defense conferred with him, and ultimately he said he was not going to. Now, there are a number of issues with that too, because once you take a criminal case with a defendant, you should be talking about whether or not they're going to testify a million times before you get to trial. The first time you talk to him about that should not be when the judge asks that question to the client. So that's a weak argument. Maybe you only had 10 minutes to kind of prepare him for what he was going to say, but all that should have been done before that moment. So I think that just, makes the lawyers look bad. Obviously, it's the trial lawyer that they're talking about here. And then the other thing is this: the right to testify is the client's decision and only the client's decision. No one can make that decision for the client. And even when the judge asks, they have to kind of say that, no one can tell you that you can't testify if that's what you want to do. So that explanation happens. And the lawyers are supposed to have that discussion with Karmelo Anthony for probably weeks, before the trial even begins. They should have had that conversation like a dozen times before that moment. So, the Fifth Amendment right to testify thing, I don't think that's a very strong argument. But the deal that the prosecutors made, that's also very common. And I don't think that they're going to be able to say that proposed any real damage to Karmelo's defense. We'll see what the appeals court says in Texas, whether they give them oral argument on this point. And the formal point I just mentioned about the right to a public trial, that's what would happen, is a hearing would be conducted on these points. But here's one of the biggest issues with this defense, okay? This argument. The ineffective assistance of counsel argument. In order to prove that, you have to really meet a really high standard. What does that mean? It means that you have to prove that the outcome would have been different if the lawyer had done some of these things. So if the lawyer hadn't made this deal with the prosecution and they did introduce this character witness testimony, if Karmelo Anthony had taken the stand, the lawyers have to argue that the outcome would have been different, that the jurors would have seen this differently. And I don't think they can make that argument. Because I think we can all pretty much guess that if Karmelo Anthony had taken the stand, the prosecutor probably would have eviscerated him on the stand. And most defendants don't take the stand in their own defense because of that reason, because they don't want to have to answer the prosecutor's questions. And questions about why he did what he did, what the circumstances were, why he had a knife in the first place. All of those things are going to be difficult to answer and still prove a self-defense, argument. So I don't know about this one. I don't think this ineffective assistance of counsel argument is going to work, primarily because the standard is so high. They really can't prove that the outcome would have been different if the lawyer had done things the way they're saying the lawyer should have done them. All right. Now, this last one actually does have some teeth. Okay. One of the other arguments that Karmelo Anthony's legal team makes is that Judge John Roach, the trial judge, should be recused because they say he's biased. Why? Well, The judge did an interview, a public interview, with a local TV station in Texas, where he said that the jury got it right. The reporter asked him, did the jury get this case right? And he said yes, because they looked at the evidence, they did everything they were supposed to do by the book, etc. Now, the lawyers argue that because he already believes the verdict was correct, that means he cannot preside over any proceedings trying to overturn that same verdict. Now, this argument does have teeth because the case is not over yet. And while it's not illegal for the judge to talk to the media in this case, it's pretty unwise, because if the case isn't over until all the appeals are done, and the judge knows that he's going to have to look at some of these motions and some of these arguments again. Everybody appeals in criminal cases because you have the right to an appeal. And so everybody does it, even when it's an open and shut case. It happens. So the judge knows this appeal is coming. The lawyers in this case filed the appeal very soon after the verdict. And so it wasn't really wise for the judge to do this interview. I will not say that I think that the statements the judge made necessarily rise to the level of bias. I think the judge can say, yes, I think the jury got it right, in the sense that they looked at the evidence and they based their decision on the evidence. But that doesn't mean he's completely unmovable. And if the lawyers make a proper argument, that he won't be able to see their points and rule fairly. But this is a good argument. Now, even still, okay, if Karmelo Anthony's lawyers win this particular argument about the judge recusal, all right, so what will happen is there'll be a hearing on this portion first, whether the judge should be recused or not. Why? Because the other points have to be ruled on by this judge if he's not recused, all right? So there'll be a hearing on this first, and another judge in that same court will evaluate these arguments and decide whether this judge should recuse himself or not. The other option is that the judge could just recuse himself on his own. He doesn't have to wait for the hearing if he doesn't want to. But in any case, if he doesn't, there'll be a hearing. That judge will decide whether this judge should recuse himself. And then whoever gets appointed as judge over this case will then look at the other, what I call the substantive arguments, the merit arguments, the one about ineffective assistance of counsel and the right to a public trial. Okay, somebody else will look at that if Judge Roach is recused. All right, but I'm not sure another judge will save them in this case, because the other arguments, like I said, they're pretty weak. I don't think that they're going to get a new trial based upon the limited access to the public, because that's the case in pretty much every trial that happens. Everybody is not going to have a seat that wants to have a seat in a big trial like this. And that's not what that right means. It doesn't mean everyone gets a seat. It just means that everyone has access to what has happened. And unless they can prove that there were pertinent records that were being withheld from the public, I don't think that's going to work, like I mentioned. So, and then obviously the ineffective assistance of counsel, whether you see those arguments as meritorious or not, the standard is very high. You have to prove that the outcome would have been different. And I don't think you can prove that here. So, but as for the judge recusal, we'll see what happens there. There will be a hearing. This process is going to take a long time. Okay. Justice moves very, very slow. And it could ultimately be months and months before even these arguments are decided by a court. And there will be, I'm sure, future appeals for Karmelo Anthony. But ultimately, all of his appeals, I think, are going to fail. And he will end up serving his sentence, at least the 17 and a half years, until he gets parole, which, in my opinion, is really kind of merciful given what has happened here. Because if he was only 1 year older, he would have gotten life for this crime. And he still has time to get out, have a good life, And hopefully, he has learned something from what has happened to him here. Now, I want to talk about what this case means in terms of being a kingdom witness. Someone who is dedicated to being a witness for Jesus Christ. How do you look at this situation? How do you look at the appeal? How do you look at this whole circumstance involving these two young men who both essentially lost their lives? I mean, Karmelo Anthony still has one, but he's losing a good portion of his youth, certainly. And of course, Austin Metcalf, who lost his life. How do you look at this? Well, the first thing is you have to protect yourself from deceptive influence. Okay. I talked about in the Kingdom Witness Appeal that Christians should always be concerned with 4 things. That is reverence. That means reverence for God, identity, keeping and maintaining an identity and a view of yourself that is in accordance with what God sees about you. Conscience. The Bible talks about a seared conscience. And you have to protect yourself from that. You have to maintain a conscience that's constantly connected with the Lord and with his truth. Otherwise, you're going to start compromising in order to keep up with the world's definitions of kindness or compassion, which are not the same as God's standards. And last, and most pertinent here, is influence. You want to protect yourself from deceptive influence, and you don't want to become a deceptive influencer. So how can you do that? Well, use some primary sources, or use sources that you know are coming from primary places. So what I mean by primary resources, that means transcripts from the trial. That means listening to the witnesses. That means not necessarily sharing inaccurate information on social media, such as the jury was all white. That's a lie. The jury was not all white. Stop sharing that. You sound crazy. Okay. There were no black people on the jury. That's true. And one of the reasons for that was, at least one of the reasons, I don't know if all of the potential jurors who were black were dismissed because of this, but many of them said that they would not be able to put a young black man behind bars. And that means you're biased before you even hear the case. So they have to dismiss you as a juror if you say something like that. You have to be willing to put someone in prison if they do the wrong thing and if the prosecution proves the case, regardless of who that person is and what their race is. So that's that. But here's the biggest problem with this particular statement. When you say that the jury was all white, even if the jury was all white, what's your point? Are you saying that there's some sort of moral presumption that just because everyone in the jury is white, that they're willing to put a 17-year-old in prison for something that he shouldn't go to prison for just because he's black? That's a pretty startling assumption that you're making about white people and their moral compass. So that's wrong. We shouldn't assume that all white people are willing to do something like that to someone just because they're black. So even if the jury was all white, which they were not, but even if they were, it's wrong for us to make that kind of assumption. Okay, that's not something we should be doing. As a matter of fact, that is racist. Okay. All right. Here's the other thing you can do if you want to keep track of this case. You want to watch podcasts and shows that cover these cases real in detail. Okay. So Law & Crime is one of my favorite crime podcasts. I keep up with this stuff as a lawyer. I'm a criminal law junkie. I love it, even though I'm a civil lawyer. I'm a litigator. I don't litigate in the criminal context, only in the civil context. But Law & Crime is a good one. And if you want one that's going to break down each piece of what happened in this case, Law & Crime on the Case is a great one. They have summaries, video summaries of what has happened. And for this appeal, they have pretty good summaries on there. And if you go to Law & Crime Plus, they have an app. You can find some of the court documents there. Now, for Law & Crime, you have to pay. But if you want free ones, you can actually go to the court site and find it. But I know sometimes that's hard for people to do. So you would go to the court where this trial took place, and you can search in the case name, Karmelo Anthony's name, and a lot of times some of that stuff will come up for you. Usually it's available publicly. All right. So we have an obligation to make decisions based on truth, not emotion. So try to use sober judgment with this stuff. I know it's emotional, and especially the things you see on social media and these clips about, people making this whole thing about race, which this case is not about race. It's about some high school students that, are making really bad decisions, basically. And Karmelo Anthony made a really bad decision here. So, but anyhow, we will see how this appeal progresses. It will likely take years for the verdict to be finalized and for everything to be solidified. And so if you really care about this case, you're going to have to be in it for the long haul, because that's how cases are. That's how the legal process happens. So that's it for today.